Hello and welcome to our side event on forced sterilization, organized and co-sponsored by Her Rights Initiative, Women's Legal Center, Sexual Rights Initiative, International Disability Alliance, probono.org, AWID, TOSIP, ARROW, Choice for Youth and Sexuality, and the Center for Reproductive Rights. My name is Rupsa Mallik, and I'm the Director of Programs and Innovation at CREA, and I'll be moderating today's conversation. CREA is part of the Sexual Rights Initiative, which is a coalition of national and regional organizations based in Canada, Poland, India, Egypt, Argentina, and South Africa that work together to advance human rights. Just give me a second. Related to sexuality at the UN. I think we'll start first with some logistics information, just so we are sure that everybody is comfortable, settled in, are able to access the language you want to hear, etc. So we have interpretation and captioning in English, Spanish, and French. To select the language of your preference, click Interpretation. This is the world icon from your control panel below. Then click the language that you would like to hear. Once you've selected your language, you can click on the interpretation icon again and select Mute Original Audio from the same menu so that you can hear the interpreters more clearly. To turn on English captions, click Live Transcript in the controls at the top of your screen. You will see the captioning on the bottom of your screen. If you need to adjust the caption size, click on the arrow next to Stop Start Video and choose Video Settings. Click on Accessibility. Move the slider to adjust the caption size. For captions in English and French, please copy and paste the links that will be provided in the chat box. If you need any additional technical support, please feel free to type in the chat box, and colleagues from SRI will be able to assist you. So now that we're done with the logistics announcement, let me get the discussion started with a brief opening remark and also introduce our fantastic panel of speakers. Sterilization is one of the most widely used forms of contraception in the world. Sterilization has also been a much used tool to advance an ableist, eugenic, heteronormative, and population control agenda, often grounded in beliefs around racial, ethnic, and religious subordination. Across the world, state-sanctioned forced sterilization policies have targeted and continue to target women and persons of diverse gender identities, expressions, and sex characteristics who are marginalized and subject to intersecting forms of discrimination, including on the basis of their HIV status, race, class, gender identity, sex characteristics, immigration status, or disability. Forced sterilization does not always manifest in one way. It can take the form of family members, medical professionals, or the state, among others. It also tends to receive less attention than other reproductive rights issues, as it often affects people who may not be part of mainstream sexual and reproductive health and rights advocacy. It is crucial, therefore, to address forced sterilization and impunity for these violations in order to ensure the realization of sexual and reproductive health and rights. Even as standard setting for consent, in particular informed consent to a medical procedure, has evolved and translated into international human rights and national laws and reflected in a growing body of jurisprudence around the world, it has not succeeded in stopping the practice of forced, and involuntary sterilization. Till date, a range of incentives or coercive pressures have been employed to secure agreement to sterilization. For a long time, the issue of forced sterilization has been limited within a public health and quality of care discourse in many countries, and this too has limited the way progressive human rights standard setting on this issue has not translated into effective measures in stopping the practice and/or access to justice for those who have been forcibly sterilized. It has, in fact, been left to movements, often self-led movements representing those most affected by these atrocities, to visibilize the issue and demand justice and reparations. I want to conclude by highlighting that often responses to forced sterilization has remained narrowly wedged within the notion of informed consent, an idea that one should know and provide affirmative agreement to a procedure. In recent years, the understanding of consent has significantly shifted and seen as a legal construct. Legal capacity to consent, advanced by the disability rights movement and more recently the intersex community, challenging the deeply rooted prejudices that define capacity and result in denial of consent. This is something that needs wider discussion. The continuing by governments, institutions, that the consent of certain persons is irrelevant because the state or the people must protect its interest and that of a collective entity must be challenged. It is therefore with great pleasure and privilege that I want to first go ahead and introduce our speakers, welcome them to this panel, and they will go on to speak about some of these issues that I have highlighted and much more. So I'm going to go ahead and introduce all the speakers at one go, just so we don't interrupt the discussion as it's going on. Our first speaker is Maria Camila Lozano Ruiz. She describes herself as a 31-year-old woman with an intellectual disability, a business administration student, and human rights advocate for women and persons with disabilities. She is a self-advocate of ASDAM Colombia, an active member of the Colombian Coalition for the implementation of the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. Our second speaker, Ms. Sethembiso-Promise Mthembu, is the co-founder of Her Rights Initiative. Mthembu is a feminist, activist, and advocate for women living with HIV. As a woman living with HIV, Mthembu was forced into sterilization at the age of 22. Mthembu is one of the feminists leading advocacy, research, and supporting litigation work on forced sterilization of women living with HIV in South Africa. Ms. Alisa Lombard is affiliated with Semaganis Worme Lombard. Ms. Lombard is lead counsel on a proposed class action pertaining to the forced sterilization of Indigenous women in Saskatchewan. For her advocacy in this matter, she was recognized in Chatelain's Women of the Year 2018. Ms. Lombard has appeared before levels of court, including the Supreme Court of Canada, administrative tribunals and international committees and commissions, including the United Nations Committee Against Torture and the Inter-American Commission for Human Rights. Ms. Lombard is a devoted citizen of the LC First Nation. Apologies for the mispronunciation. Ms. Tlaleng Mofokeng, Dr. T, as she is often known and referred to, from South Africa, was appointed as Special Rapporteur by the UN Human Rights Council at its 44th session in July 2020. She is a medical doctor with expertise advocating for universal health access, HIV care, youth-friendly services, and family planning. And finally, but not the least, Mandi Mudarikwa is an attorney at the Women's Legal Center who has spent the past 11 years working in the social justice legal sector, mainly focusing on the realization of the right to equality and non-discrimination for people who are marginalized and made invisible by the operation of laws, policies, and practices. Over the years, this has included working on precedent setting, strategic impact litigation in local, regional, and international courts that adopts intersectional feminism as the lens to dismantle inequality, exclusion, and discrimination. So warm welcome again to all the speakers. Without further ado, I'm going to start off the first round of discussions and will request you, Camila, to start us off by sharing a little bit about the context of forced sterilization in your country. And starting us off, you'll have about 6 minutes to speak. Thank you, Camila.
En Colombia han mejorado algunas cosas en los últimos años sobre el reconocimiento de la capacidad de las personas con discapacidad para decidir sobre nuestras vidas y cuerpos. Pero aún nos falta mucho. En mi país han dicho que van a implementar la Convención de Derechos de las Personas con Discapacidad. Han puesto normas y leyes, pero no se cumplen en la realidad. Además, falta mucha información entre los ciudadanos y cambia la mentalidad de las personas sobre la discapacidad y sobre nuestro derecho a decidir sobre todos los aspectos de nuestras vidas. Creen que somos niños eternos, enfermos o que necesitamos lástima. Y creen que no tenemos derechos sobre nuestro cuerpo y sexualidad. La mayoría de los médicos aconsejan a las familias que hagan la esterilización a las mujeres con discapacidad, diciendo que así va a evitar las violaciones. Por eso hay muchas más mujeres que hombres con discapacidad que han sido esterilizadas sin sus consentimientos. Se equivoca cuando no nos deja decidir sobre nuestros propios cuerpos y nuestro futuro. Así no nos ayuda a prevenir las violaciones o el abuso sexual. Lo único es que evita que queremos embarazar. Y muchas niñas esterilizadas siguen siendo víctimas de violaciones, sin que nadie sepa. Además, no puedes saber cómo la esterilización termina afectando a las mujeres con discapacidad en lo emocional, psicológico. Además, las familias de las personas con discapacidad en la mayoría de los casos no dejan que la persona con discapacidad decida, sino que la familia decide sin escuchar las opiniones de las personas con discapacidad. Y también les engaña para llevar a los médicos para hacer la operación. Muchas veces sin explicar la consecuencia o el procedimiento. La familia escucha a los médicos y no pregunta por otras opiniones. La discapacidad se sigue viendo como un tema de salud. Y eso hace que lo que digan los médicos se vuelva una verdad. Y que si ellos recomiendan la esterilización, la hagan pensando que está bien y que así nos protege. Cuando en realidad nos están negando nuestro derecho. También hemos entendido que los médicos lo que quieren es que no nazca otra persona con discapacidad. Y por eso intenta que la esterilización sea la única alternativa. Desde mi trabajo como activista, estuve ante el comité de CEDAW en el 2014 en Washington, denunciando en Colombia que se permite la esterilización de menores con discapacidad con la autorización de su padre o madre. Gracias a esa denuncia se hizo un llamado de atención a Colombia y se prohibió la esterilización de menores con discapacidad en el año 2016. Gracias.
Thank you so much, Camila. I think your remarks have really highlighted two aspects of what we continue to see. One is this kind of rhetoric of protection, and therefore this idea of forced sterilization as a solution to protect against violence. And the other, of course, is sort of the eugenic beliefs that continue to guide the way women with disabilities continue to face this violation. I will now move on to our next speaker, Promise Mthembu. Promise, I would like to ask you the same question. Please help set the context in terms of what is the issue around forced sterilization in your country and how it manifests. Thank you, Promise.
Thank you very much, moderator, and thanks to SRI, other co-sponsors, and my co-panelists. Yeah, I'm going to be talking about forced and coerced sterilizations of women living with HIV in South Africa. This is something that has been happening for at least 3 decades. So HIV positive women being targeted for sterilization in maternal health services where they go to deliver babies, and also in abortion services. These would be mainly very young, Black and poor HIV positive women. Until this year, we'd seen only Black African HIV positive women, but recently had a young Black Indian woman coming forward to say this has happened to her. So the youngest woman we have was forced into sterilization was just 18 years old. So they are teenagers. The bulk of the women were sterilized in their 20s, and very few women were sterilized in their 30s. We think that the violation is systematic, because when we started, there was an idea that it's happening like in a couple of hospitals, as it were. But when we're forced to conduct research on the matter by our National Department of Health, who basically did not believe us when we said this was happening, and basically sent us back to produce scientifically documented research as community women, we realized that there is an indication that it is systematic, in the sense that we did research in 2 different provinces, but the modus operandi and where women was targeted, and the demographics of women that were targeted was the same. Later on, the South African National AIDS Council, in collaboration with the Human Sciences Research Council, conducted research which they were calling the HIV Stigma Index in 2015. And 7.4 of women who participated in that study who are living with HIV reported that they'd been forced into sterilization in the past 12 months. So that confirmed, the fact that this is systematic. In our research, for an example, the women that had come forward were actually coming from 15 hospitals and reporting, that exactly the same thing is happening to them. Why is it happening? As Rupsa, the moderator said, we think it's coming from neo-eugenics, obviously looking at the, political and economic history of our country. It has to do with Malthusian, policies, that are advancing, reducing the population of the poor to address poverty, instead of doing it the other way around. And it's obviously coming from racism, in the sense that forced sterilization in South Africa is, rooted in population control of apartheid South Africa. And also in the context of HIV, we think that it's also easy in the sense that most of the women were actually sterilized when there were policies about prevention of mother-to-child transmission, the politics of saving babies, and essentially that giving doctors access to women's womb so that they violate them. And at a global level, the global AIDS policy is promoting integration of sexual and reproductive rights services into HIV services, but what that means, for us is that they are integrating human rights violations with regards to HIV positive women. And also when you look closely at what is being integrated, they actually are just integrating contraceptives, and contraceptives on their own are not sexual and reproductive health services. I have 2 minutes. And what is it that we've been doing? We started with advocacy and later ventured into research on this issue. So advocacy for change at government policy level and practice. Our work also has like a huge component of consciousness building and movement building for HIV positive women who are sterilized, but also other HIV positive women. We've used constitutional bodies because we lodged a formal complaint to the Commission for Gender Equality here in South Africa. We also are working very closely with the Women's Legal Center, probono.org, and other organizations to put forward a litigation strategy, because we believe that justice for the women actually does not lie in the negotiations, but lies in the court of law, because this is a matter of gross human rights violations. Thank you.
Thank you, Promise. I think you have, in your very brief 6 minutes, and I hope I didn't rush you, managed to really lay out the complex rationale sometimes that is put out there to justify something that's coercive, abusive, violating an individual's rights. And I think what it points towards, and we'll come to that in our second round of discussions, is therefore how do we approach these issues? Therefore the need to, foreground an intersectional analysis, and therefore intersectional ways in which we do our advocacy. And of course, I know you will be able to share some of the examples of what you all have been doing. I want to now turn to Alisa, warm welcome, and wanted to kind of ask you the same question in terms of kind of setting the context vis-a-vis Canada and the work that you've done, and really again kind of foregrounding sort of both the historical context of what Indigenous women, not just in Canada, but around the world, have had to encounter, and sort of the continuity of those practices, even as the language of it has shifted, maybe, and the articulation of it has shifted, but the fact that it continues. And so over to you, Alisa, and you have roughly 6 minutes.
Thank you. I'm very honored to be here today with my colleagues from around the world to discuss this very important issue. I just want to take a very brief moment to acknowledge, and I don't know if you have all heard in the news, that they have found the remains and unmarked graves of 761 children, approximately 2 hours here from Saskatoon, at the former residential school in Cowessess First Nation. And so if we talk about context, I think it is important to talk about that type of context. That school operated until 1997. And so as far as forced sterilization is concerned, in Canada, what we're looking at is a legacy of explicit eugenics. We had the Sexual Sterilization Acts in British Columbia and Alberta. That act was not passed in Saskatchewan historically, but it failed by a singular vote. And so what we see is that we see the adoption of those attitudes within the cohort of medical practitioners and those who are involved in the running of the delivery of healthcare services, and particularly maternal and obstetric healthcare services to Indigenous women and other women. What we do see here in Saskatchewan from our experience is a very disproportionate impact of the eugenics movement on the Indigenous population, and that is borne out by empirical research into the records that are very scant of the eugenics boards that were established to make these decisions. It is clear and it is demonstrable that Indigenous women were disproportionately sterilized without consent. Now, those acts no longer exist. However, physicians, and in particular staff practitioners who are given privileges to work within hospitals that are run by health authorities, which occupy the constitutional provincial ground and deliver public health care services as a matter of public health, our universal healthcare system by the Canada Health Act and what it provides for, continue to do this. And they continue to do this across the country. And I see a lot of synergies with what my colleagues from around the world have spoken about in terms of how this practice manifests. Here, what we see and what we have seen are sterilizations that are as recent as 2018 in the province of Saskatchewan and as recent as 2019 in the province of Quebec. And so how we see this manifest is essentially a woman presents as pregnant, delivers her child either vaginally or by cesarean section, leaves, and is not able to have other children. The proposition is put to her while she's either in the throes of labor or while she is in a significant amount of pain. I'm not sure if everyone here has had a child, but while you're in the throes of labor, it is not usually the best time to have a discussion about whether you ever want to do that again. And so that is how we see this practice manifesting in the short 6 minutes that we have to explain this. And I expect that we'll get into the measures that we've taken to address the practice and to demand its prevention, punishment, its absolute cessation, and reparations for the essentially dozens at least of women who have gone through this excruciating experience and continue to suffer.
Thank you, Alisa. I think you have really highlighted both the kind of, really the deep, dark kind of legacy of eugenics and what we continue to see in your eugenic practices, as some of earlier speakers have also highlighted. And I think really as the world, looks ahead, and I turn to you, Dr. T, really, I know there's been some history of standard setting within the UN system on the issue of forced sterilization, but would really be interested to hear from you both what broadly within the human rights system and more specifically your mandate have been some of the work that's happened on forced sterilization. And in particular, one of the things that stands out for me, just hearing the first three speakers and sort of the multiplicity and the complexity of the way that forced sterilization has been used as a tool, I think it would be also really interesting to hear from you what have been some of the ways that the issue has been framed, definitionally, conceptually, otherwise, that allows us to kind of bring in this complexity of understanding and therefore respond. The human rights standard setting is able to be responsive to that sort of complexity. So I'll turn it over to you, Dr. T, and warm welcome.
Thank you so much, Rupsa, and good afternoon and good morning, good evening to all of you colleagues and many friends of myself in this call today. And I speak, of course, as the United Nations Special Rapporteur on the right to health, but I am a medical doctor in clinical practice, and I speak as someone who knows and has experienced the harm of reproductive and sexual violence. And often when we speak about structural violence or even gender-based violence, we often speak and focus more on intimate partner violence and not enough on systemic violence. And I know this violence intimately because I trained at the University of KwaZulu-Natal. Back in the days, we used to have a lot of women who used to come and have some surgical exploration and seeking assistance. And I didn't know at the time that this issue was such a big problem. It's only when I became an intern and then a community service doctor working in more of the peri-urban centers that I came face to face with this issue of forced or coerced sterilization. And at the time, it was actually broadly about people seeking to control women and stifle and restrict our autonomy. And the social and body politics that set the rules for how many of us exist in this world speak to the fact that our bodies are a site of politics and a site of violence. And I think that's where most of our feminist activism comes from. And today, that's what I want to speak from. It's knowing the intersectionality of race and class. And in some instances, like South Africa, your geographical location means certain things. And there are ways in which medicine itself has let women down in terms of medical ethics. And also the state has let many women down across the world in terms of their duty of care. And so speaking about the UN human rights system, this issue has been examined before, and forced sterilization has been defined as torture, as violence against women, as discrimination against women, racial discrimination, and definitely a violation of the right to health. And we know that the right to health is a broad mandate, but it does have very specific entitlements. And one of them is to have autonomy over one's body and what happens. And we know also then the violations also speak to people with disabilities and also to children. And a lot of people who are institutionalized often then become victims of forced and coerced sterilization. And of course, it is important to also talk about justice and what reparations look like. And how do we end forced sterilization in the many countries and in all the regions of the world. And it's very important to also understand that the actual principles that are being violated are rights to equality, non-discrimination, bodily integrity, personal security, sexual and reproductive health rights, issues around informed consent, freedom from torture and other ill treatment, privacy, very important one. We're dealing with the issues right now in South Africa where, people are demanding information about women who have experienced this, and people do not know to what end and how are you going to utilize my information. And also we know that absolutely this experience has negative impact on women's health and physical and as well as mental health. It violates their rights to fully participate in society in terms of social life, political life, economic life. And we know that the resultant violation also has impact of women on both women and their families too. And so when we're thinking about correcting the wrongs, we can't then just end with women. And I'll give you an example in South Africa. The issues of inheritance and land and title deeds are very much tied to the patriarchal system of having men being the ones who can inherit land and assets. And so, when you have women who are then under patriarchal and societal pressure to then have boy children, even though we know that scientifically it's not even women who determine in terms of genetics, right? But the pressure is on women to produce these male heirs. And we know when you live in those societies, the pressure, and you can get ostracized as a woman and get, often experience also housing and economic insecurity as a result. And so just briefly before, I'm sure we'll have a lot of time to go into the other details, but in my last General Assembly report, I did speak about the issue of forced and coerced sterilization as an important one. In the current Human Rights Council report, I also speak about this issue again, and it will be an issue in focus for me during my tenure. The UN has different ways and different mechanisms and different ways that we can intervene. Either we can respond to a letter of allegation that will be submitted to my mandate. We are able to enjoin cases as amicus curiae and provide the courts with those necessary perspectives. And of course, today being one of the ways, right, it's engaging with civil society to understand firsthand how these issues affect people. And really, for me, it's about meaningful engagement. And in terms of reproductive control and its roots, and people have spoken about colonialism, right, and its need to supply of slave labor. But today, a lot of philanthropists, a lot of public health, a lot of sexual reproductive health programming are continuing to perpetuate those narratives, and something called ecofascism, where the issues around climate change, right, environmental destruction, are often attributed to the reproduction of poor Black Indigenous people or people of African descent. And so this discourse itself is rooted in racist, classist paradigms, which must be eradicated. And that's why even in my Human Rights Council report, just was delivered this week, I focus specifically on anti-racism, non-discrimination, and using intersectional frameworks as a way forward to try and get to substantive equality, to end racism and all of the other systems of oppression that it enables. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. T, and always for your powerful advocacy and really saying it as it is. I think it is very, very important to not just look at the historical context in with regard to this issue, but the continued belief system and the use of this, of forced and forced sterilization in contemporary public health practices and the way donors are conceptualizing their policies and funding. And I think it is really critical that at the UN human rights system that some of these issues are being spoken about. So we thank you always for your powerful advocacy. I think you really created the perfect setting for us to, in fact, move into the second part of our discussion, which is to really hear from some of our speakers and activists about the way that they have, in their either country context or in the international context, really what were some of the strategies that they have used, some of the lessons learned, some of the continuing challenges. And in particular, I think I'm struck by the fact that many of them represent very powerful self-led movements. And I know that in many country contexts, many of these movements have sometimes come together and have been able to, in fact, do very effective, advocacy. So I would also urge all the speakers, where possible, to really also share with us if you have any examples of the kind of cross-movement solidarity building that you've been successful in doing. And if not, to flag the challenges, because I think that is something that will be critical as we move forward in our advocacy. And so we would be very interested to hear from you about your successes and your challenges. So Camila, I will come back to you and we'll follow the same order of speakers. So Camila, I would request you to share with us some of the work you've done in Colombia in terms of the national strategies that have been used, some of the lessons learned, and some of the challenges. And maybe given that there is not so much time, we'll probably stick to about 6 to 8 minutes per speaker, maybe highlight one or two of the key strategies that you think would be the most important to share. Thank you, Camila.
Hay dos estrategias muy importantes que están.
There are two very important strategies that we are using in Colombia to fight against the sterilization of people with disability. Some organizations are doing training on sexual and reproductive rights for people with disabilities. And this has meant that youths nowadays have a greater awareness on our rights, and we are able to identify the different types of violence that we can fall victims to. Having more information on our sexuality and our rights is a way of protecting ourselves. This has also helped changing the mindset of families who now listen to our opinions and wishes so they can understand that they can accompany us and guide us in our decisions, but not decide on our behalf. This also shows that there are doctors and healthcare professionals who's changed their mindset to recognize that our opinions and wishes are important and must be taken into account. Also, in 2019, Law 1996 was adopted, and this recognizes the ability of the legal capacity of people with disabilities and eliminated the ban. And this means they can no longer place us under guardianship, so all decisions affecting us are taken by them. Rather, it recognizes that we have the right to take our decisions and that what we need is support, but that at the end of the day, the decision is ours. And this means they can no longer go to a judge to remove our rights with the purpose of sterilization. Rather, they require us to give our authorization to go ahead with these procedures. Nevertheless, many judges, doctors, and families themselves have not understood this legal change and believe that this legal change is making us more vulnerable, and they continue to breach the new law. Also, in many parts of the country, this law is unknown. So we still have a lot more work to do for this law to be fully implemented. I feel very proud of participating in getting this law submitted, and I have to thank many organizations for their support in making this a reality for people with disabilities. With this new law, they will no longer be able to decide anything on our bodies without us. Gradually, more and more people will understand that people with disabilities do understand and can take decisions on our bodies and our lives. Slowly and gradually, we have to make society change its mindset. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Camila. I think more than ever, you've highlighted some of the things that I was highlighting in my opening remarks about foregrounding issues of decisional and bodily autonomy and being able to frame or create standards around legal capacity. The harm of guardianship regimes and conservatorship, uh, it is something that continues to till date across and we see it present in so many laws in so many of our countries. And therefore, congratulations on your success in Colombia and on your successful advocacy. And I think there is much that we can learn from the incredible work, I think, not just the disability rights activists have done in Colombia, but globally. And I think if we look at the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, we see some of the most progressive language on sexual and reproductive health and rights, and an articulation and a very expansive articulation on the issue of legal capacity and the right to bodily autonomy. So thank you again for your advocacy and your work in Colombia. But I think overall the disability movement's contribution in advancing some of these discussions have been incredible, and many movements have drawn inspiration and have adapted some of those strategies from what the disability movement has been able to accomplish. I'll move to you, Promise, and ask you the same question about sort of some of the strategies that you've been using in your work Of course, some of the lessons learned, but also do highlight some of the challenges. And I am not sure if you've had a chance to scan some of the questions that have been directed to you, but if you have, then if there was some things that you could begin to address in your remarks, then please feel free to do so. But we will have time for a separate session on question and answer, so we could use that time as well.
Thank you very much. Okay, I'll go straight into the strategies, and hopefully we'll have time to deal with the questions. So our strategy as Rights Initiative, it has mainly been advocacy. We are a feminist organization, and we are inspired by intersectionality and post-colonial feminisms. So that is the analysis that we've been applying in our advocacy work from the beginning. So looking at why are women living with HIV got to this point? What was it? What were the marginalizations and exclusions that led them to have HIV in the first place, and why they are here? And then we look at how sterilization interact with those marginalization in the past, the present, and how is it going to look like in the future. We are a post-colonial society, and this is an issue for Black women, so we have to apply that analysis as well. We've also been very consistent because we've been doing this work for 14 years now. Not many successes, but consistency in terms of keeping the women together, and keeping the voice, out there. I also think that as an organization, we've been very fortunate to be able to enter into strategic partnerships with organizations in the feminist space, feminist academics, feminist lawyers, feminist researchers, feminist doctors like Dr. T, and also obviously the Women's Legal Center, which is a feminist legal organization. And I must state this, that our starting point is that we look at a woman living with HIV, we define her and where she sits in society. And I've spoken about the fact that we have support from feminist, spaces, no support whatsoever from the HIV, space, although we are women living with HIV, and we, like we mentioned this a lot, because, basically our issue rejected by the HIV establishment, both in civil society policy and also at a global level. And although we have the Department of Health in South Africa as one of our targets, we actually do not think this is a health issue. It's a human rights issue, and it's about Blackness and reproduction. It's about the politics of reproduction. And also we, like when we started, we were fortunate to have the opportunity of collaborating with a credible academic institution to conduct our first study in this regard. And that was a novel study really around the world, the first ever study that looked at forced sterilizations of HIV positive women. So that gave us credibility and sort of gave us a direction of where we want to, to go. We've been working in partnerships with women living with HIV in Namibia, for an example, women living with HIV in Kenya, to try and support each other and also influence spaces at a global level. We also lodged a complaint to the Commission for Gender Equality, which is a constitutional body. And we did this after realizing that maybe the court, realizing at the time that maybe the court is not where we get justice because of prescription issues, and we have now put those aside. And that investigation, it took 5 years, but post 5 years, which is where we are now, I think we've made gains in the sense that although the report is not giving us much in terms of recommendations, but it has affirmed all international law in this regard, and that is able to take us forward. It has also elevated forced sterilizations of HIV positive women beyond just, issues of bodily integrity, choice, racism, denial of sexual and reproductive rights. It has elevated it to torture, because one of the findings that we were subjected to torturous, inhuman and degrading treatment. And what is important about this finding is that it didn't just come, it is a result of advocacy, which we did 10 years ago in 2011, where together with South Africa and Namibia, and OSI, we targeted the Special Rapporteur on torture to say, they must include women living with HIV in people that are targeted for sterilization. So 10 years later, that advocacy started, just inclusion of that phrase actually led to the Commission for Gender Equality in South Africa making a finding on torture. And the challenges and the lessons learned, we've done all this work, but women don't have justice. Women do not have justice. And one of the greatest limitations of our work is that we spend so much time targeting our advocacy to the National Department of Health and not to the state. So that's one of the huge lessons learned, to say, justice is elsewhere, not in the Department of Health. And the Department of Health can't be the player and the referee. So that's one lesson learned. The other lesson that we have learned is that we focused on the external, the human rights, the violation, the politics, and we left out the mind and the body. And it is only now, that we realize that actually this is not necessarily about the scar that women have to see every day. It's not about being barren. It's about what happens to the body and mind, the psychological, effects, the health effects, the mental health effects that women are struggling with every day. It has actually reached a crisis, a proportion, and things that Dr. T was talking about, that it has direct impact on women accessing social, economic opportunities, and it has made some of the women to be homeless, for an example, so that's one of the lessons that we've learned, that you cannot separate the two. And in fact, the body and mind should have been our priority, but we are prioritizing it now as we work on other, areas of justice, litigation, that we are thinking about. Mental health and bodily support is one of our key strategies. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Promise. I think more than ever, I think what stands out for me is one, that the fault lines, both within our movements and across our movements, are deep. And I think you had to confront that in your advocacy. Two, I think what is really useful and interesting is the way you shifted the narrative, use different mechanisms to begin to frame this issue of forced sterilization in terms of torture, etc. And finally, I think it is so important to kind of acknowledge that, even as this discussion has remained within this domain of health and public health, and a lot of our advocacy has targeted, therefore, health departments, that there are, it's not just that, but we have to move beyond that framing, and really also the long-term implications about mental health, which is something I think is, again, under-addressed, I would say, not unaddressed. But thank you so much. And I think this is a really useful intervention on your part, and there's so many takeaways. I'll turn to you, Alisa, next, and really, again, ask you to share about some of the strategies y'all adopted, including strategic litigation, and of course, all the lessons learned and any successes or challenges that you'd like to share.
Thank you. I think, at the base of any strategy, when human rights violations are concerned, I think it has to be survivor centric. And so we must tell the truth, we must tell it often, and we must tell it completely. And so that has been our approach. And where it has been possible, we have brought women who have experienced this together so that they can share their stories, of course, in the most trauma-informed way that is possible in the circumstances. One of the driving principles of our strategy, or our truth-telling journey, I guess, as advocates for these hundreds of women who have experienced forced sterilization, is to really center around the concept of bodily autonomy. Canada is not one of those countries that does not have a, Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms, that does not entrench a lot of these principles that exist internationally within its domestic law. What it does have, the very serious problem that Canada does have is a failure to implement or to ensure equal accessibility or benefit of the law to marginalized populations, including Indigenous people. And perhaps I should say notably, we have really pointed to, particularly in Saskatchewan, and this may sound like a minor detail, but it is not, because it came as a piece of awareness. The Saskatchewan health cards had a race-based indicator on the front of them, and on the face of them, there's an embossed R, which indicates that the holder of the card is a registered Indian. Of course, I don't know if everyone will be aware of this. Canada has the only race-based piece of legislation left on the planet. It is called the Indian Act. It governs our life from womb to tomb. We get 10 numbers, we get a card. They call that a band number. And this is what we use to access particular services or benefits, or to prove our indigeneity, so to speak, in many instances. And so we see some movement away from that with Canada's adoption of the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples just a few days ago. And so we see some positive movement, and I think that it's really encouraging. The trouble, however, remains in terms of how do marginalized women and oppressed women who underreport human rights violations access equally the benefits of the law. And so we have found that having the women speak to one another and creating those networks has been really valuable. When we went to Quito, Ecuador a few years ago before the pandemic hit like a lightning bolt across the globe, we brought the stories of some of the women that we represent to some of the Quechua women who were there. And it was interesting to see the translation, because of course the story was shared in English, then it was translated to Spanish, and then it was translated to Quechua. So there was a delay, but you could see that there was a bond there. And I would even venture to say that it is a trauma bond on the issue of that experience. And so we found that really focusing on the issue of bodily autonomy and the existence of those legal frameworks within the country that are simply not enforced or accessible to Indigenous people and others has been an important part of our strategy here in Canada. Of course, that's not the case everywhere. And so as far as what are some of the lessons learned, I think that it's good to do a lot of research on this issue and to get as much information as is possible. The trouble for us, of course, is that women are not always willing to come forward. There has to be a significant amount of trust. Cultural competence is very, very important. And I think it's also important to counter narratives that are harmful. And we see those. We see those coming up, not only in mainstream society, but we see them. We see them coming from governments, in particular. This emphasis on culturally competent care, I think is looking at the issue from the wrong end. The issue is racism, and so anti-racism is how we get to the point that we need to be, where the dignity of a woman's body, an Indigenous woman's body, is respected as the law provides. And so another thing that we've done a lot about is awareness raising, of course, and you have to do that in a trauma-informed way. And so we talk publicly and privately about how women across the globe are experiencing this in different iterations. And so what we have found is that Indigenous women whose reproductive experiences do not align with the state of the law, they are more willing to come forward and share their story. And so rights awareness is quintessential.
Thank you, Alisa. Yes, truth telling. And I think we've had a lot of truth telling on this panel today. I'll quickly turn to you, Dr. T. I don't want to ask you how you're going to address this in your mandate, because it is very clear from your opening remarks that it is firmly foregrounded in your mandate, in the way that you articulated it. But what I did want to ask you, that now that you're within the UN human rights system, what would be I just wanted to kind of get a sense of what is that forward-looking strategy that we could all perhaps think about when we think in the context of the UN human rights system, and what strategically makes sense, given it's a complex set of institutions and bodies with different kinds of roles and different abilities for, I would say, particularly global South advocates to both enter those spaces, be able to get themselves heard, and then of course the whole question of justice, and so really would be very, very useful, I think, for all of us and all the people who are participating today to really hear what could be some of the ways that we begin to think about the work that's needed moving forward within the human rights system. And of course, in that, please do highlight specifically within your mandate some of your plans, just so we know how we can reach you also when you are moving forward with some of those plans. Thank you, Dr. T.
Absolutely. I mean, the UN is a very complex system, and I think many people, including myself, have been calling for more inclusive and more easier way, right, of firstly reaching the UN, but also understanding the different ways that we can utilize the different systems. And in terms of human rights bodies, I was very clear and deliberate in locating these issues within that framework, because the UN had already done the work previously of already asserting the different violations around forced or coerced sterilization. It wasn't really difficult, but I think as a Black woman from the Global South, with a particular experience on this issue, I needed to be very clear about why it's important and located within its context, because remember, patriarchy and racism, and from slavery, colonialism, now neocolonialism, all of these forces are just a continuum. And so mine is to look at all issues that relate to bodily integrity. And for one moment, this is one particular issue that's highlighting some of those important issues around consent and dignity and bodily integrity. But also it's important to talk about the intersections, right? If you think about how, for example, on the surface, these issues look very different. But if you think about the harassment and the violation that Caster Semenya has been undergoing for the last decade, right? Because of world athletic bodies and the regulations they've made around her specific track races. It's again about controlling Black women and punishing Black women for not abiding, right, by these societal and racist structures and how they police our existence in this world. So there is a continuum of these different forces that reinforce each other, that enable each other. And if you look at, so the special procedures is where my mandate is. And one of the ways of working within the mandate is to assist civil society if, they need to be, again, raising issues of awareness, including, issues around dialogue and advocacy on those many issues. It's about developing a new standard if we wanted to expand on informed consent. So I heard one of the panelists, talking about the narrow definitions of informed consent. And then when you add the intersection of people with different disabilities, it then, it manifests itself differently. So we have to take all of those things into account. I think also what's also important is to document, right, and contribute successfully to the different UN processes. And so I work very closely with other mandate holders. So if you're thinking about the Special Rapporteur on racism, if you're thinking about the CEDAW, if you're thinking about the very important one about migration and people of African descent, for example, very important to always highlight these issues, that they are not just about climate change or migration, right? That many women who are then undocumented as migrants may very well have a heightened risk of violations within health settings. And often we speak about this when people are seeking abortion services, right? And the gatekeeping that can happen for women who are either internally displaced or migrating. And so it's very important for me to constantly be bringing the intersections and making those clear, so that firstly we can change the mindset of different countries, different states, different leaders on specific issues, and where we can, push for adoption of new policies and new decisions. And I think South Africa is well placed because of this Commission for Gender Equality report, which really did a good job of affirming what women have been saying. And we can also talk about and problematize, right? The fact that women can say this happened to me for 15 years, beyond prescription, and no one hears them until someone who's seen to be a figure of authority actually affirms that. But, within those confines, I think it was good that, that was able to come through. And, on my end, I think it's about redress as well. I think it's very important to think about accountability. These are gross human rights violations, and part of accountability, again, with what Sethembiso was saying, is the issue of victim support, and how do we do that in a meaningful way that still empowers people, that still sees them and sort of allows them to take back their power and their dignity and redefine for themselves the kind of future that they can have. And so, yeah, it's important, I think, for me as well to keep my eyes on the court processes. I think as special rapporteurs, we do have that ability, again, to be friends of the court, to bring these other different elements and arguments to assist the court in making specific well, at least hearing and supporting that judicial process. And that's one thing that I will be doing publicly. I mean, a lot of special rapporteurs do join cases, but they do it confidentially. But I think the issues that affect us, we can't fight racism and sexism and ableism confidentially. These issues are embedded, they're structural, they're systemic. And for many of us, we are navigating those systems on a daily basis, and they may manifest differently, but ultimately they're driven by the very same structures. And so it's about bringing that lens to the UN itself. And we know the pushback around critical race theory. We know the pushback around intersectionality, as Professor Kimberly Crenshaw developed that model. And when people push back on that, they are pushing back on the essence of who we are, because we had to develop those theories and those frameworks to make sense of the world and make sense of what was happening to us. So we also then have to be very aware that type of rhetoric doesn't make its way into these very important UN systems and mechanisms that are supposed to be protecting and promoting human rights.
Thank you, Dr. T. I think it's really important, this work that you're doing, and I think increasingly happening. For example, the collaboration between different special procedures, different sort of treaty monitoring bodies. And for example, a couple of years ago, the statement that was put out by the CEDAW and the CRPD committee, the joint statement, stands out as a really good example about how different UN bodies can come together and really, advocate for and push for towards a common goal. Because it is also true that sometimes we've seen very disparate and mixed standard setting that has emerged from different standard setting bodies within the UN. I will now turn to you, Mandi. You've been patiently listening throughout the past hour. And really, first of all, thank you so much for partnering with SRI and all the other co-sponsors and helping frame the discussion. But we would be really interested to hear from you, both drawing on what you heard from the different speakers. What, in your view, is the role of feminist legal frameworks and interventions for violations on issues such as forced sterilization, and of course, drawing on the fantastic work that you've been doing. So over to you, Mandi. And I'll try and see if I can, I mean, I've got about 3 minutes, but maybe a minute more.
Thank you, Rupsa. Thank you, Rupsa, and thank you very much for the introduction. Thank you also to the panelists for such fantastic presentations, really contextualizing the work. And thank you for the question. So I'm from the Women's Legal Center, where our work on strategic litigation drives a feminist and African feminist agenda, where we apply an intersectional lens, because as has been mentioned by many speakers, we recognize that women are not a homogeneous group, but have diverse identities. As a result of these identities, they then experience violence and discrimination very differently in their everyday life. So within this context, the role of feminist frameworks and interventions, particularly on the issue of forced and coerced sterilization, does a number of things. And I'm just going to quickly highlight 5 things. First, as has been mentioned by many speakers, it places women, and within our context of South Africa, it places Black African women at the center of interventions. And it ensures that their power and their voices, which are often silenced, assumed to be non-existent, or ignored as the fuel of the intervention. Secondly, it critically focuses on the intersecting of oppressions that women are navigating daily within their homes, communities, and workplaces. The intersection of women's multiple identities therefore then compound the discrimination, abuse, and violation of women's rights and bodies. Interventions therefore must be developed and structured in an intersectional manner in taking all of the above into context. Thirdly, such feminist approaches specifically aim to dissect and challenge the historical. We've heard of colonial and apartheid discrimination and all the other contexts that have been spoken about, that are systematic violations of women's rights and bodies, which also then emphasize that transformation and change, to be effective and lasting, must also be systematic. Fourth, it focuses on dismantling systems of oppression in existing and continuing social legal systems currently. These systems continues to place women in their diversity as subordinate to men, and such systems include patriarchy, binary systems, heteronormativity, and criminalization of identities and sex work, among others. Lastly, but most importantly, it then places women as the drivers of redress, of justice, of transformation, and of change, emphasizing the statement that most of us here believe: nothing about women without women and their diversity. So really the role there is to really ensure that there are many other contexts, but I'm going to stop there because of time. But really the idea is to then ensure that the work being done is being done from the perspective of women, dissecting the challenges that women are facing and ensuring that even in the change, women are the change makers themselves. Thank you so much, Rupsa, and thank you for the panelists for the presentations.
Thank you, Mandi, so much, and for sticking to time. I know it was a really short time, but it was a really useful intervention. I thought we have about 10 to 12 minutes, so we do have a few questions that I've been trying to track. So I'll try and see how I can organize it, but I thought I'd start with you, Camila. There is a question from a participant who asks you, after the law in Colombia was adopted to end guardianship and protect legal capacity, has this changed in practice? Do you think families are still trying to control their daughters with disabilities informally without formally removing their legal capacity in court? Camila, you would be able to answer that.
Como había dicho en las cosas, en las preguntas, como a veces la mayoría de la ley está, pero no han cumplido la familia. O a veces, actualmente en Colombia, como dijo la ley ya 1996, se ha perdido la capacidad legal de las personas con discapacidad, pero las familias siguen haciendo, a veces escondidas, y también en Colombia como ya no se perestiliza a los menores con discapacidad, pero a veces la familia también hace en otras partes que se lo deja todavía. Como los comienzos los médicos y todo todavía. Pero falta mucho, pero a veces estamos mejorando altos tiempos. Eso es muy bien para que damos tiempo atrás. Gracias.
Thank you, Camila. I think there's a couple of questions which kind of speak to this whole issue of obstetric violence and sort of this continuum within which we need to think of it. For example, there's a participant from India who highlights how even as the issue of forced sterilization has been highlighted, the courts have ruled, the government has perhaps taken steps to address some of those coercive forced sterilizations. We are seeing the emergence of sort of postpartum IUD as the next alternative, and often women, immediately after labor are being counseled to accept IUDs. So I actually wanted to maybe ask you, Dr. T, and then Promise, if both of you would like to little bit reflect on this issue and on this whole, and there has been some amount of framing and articulation of this issue of obstetric violence. So I'll kind of leave it a bit open, but would very much welcome both your inputs vis-a-vis this question. So maybe Dr. T, first you, and then Promise, if you want to come in after that, please let me know.
Okay, sorry, just repeat the actual question.
So the question is really about how does one look, this whole issue of obstetric violence and what is that framing? And the example given by the participant was, of course, this thing about, maybe we get to the issue of forced sterilization, but then it again manifests in this, issue of IUD. And therefore, is that kind of framing needed to kind of take us, because if you, so yeah, I hope I'm clear, Dr. T, but roughly that is.
No, you are. And this is what I meant about it being a continuum, right? That's enabled by certain systems. And so to end all of these different ways that controlling and policing of women's bodies happen, we have to still be conscious of the fact that, yes, obstetric violence is a very wide definition, but within that definition, there are very clear lived experiences and very clear intersecting issues. And of course, the IUD one is important. I think there was some news about Britney Spears a few hours ago about how, she's being under guardianship and she has an IUD that she can't take out, and regardless of what her own fertility and future plans are. And so if you think about actual physical violence that women also experience in the laboring process, in hospitals and clinics, that also still fits the definition of obstetric violence. But I think it's very important, especially in advocacy, to be very clear and very targeted and map exactly where the power lies for that particular issue. And depending on the legislative framework, depending on the policy that exists, this may be harder to do in different contexts. And that's why we always have to do this work of collaborating and learning from each other, from the different global spaces that we interact with, and take some of those lessons to have impact in our own local scenarios, in our own local situations. But for me, as the SR on the right to health, I will be looking, at issues that are, I suppose, pushing back on women's dignity and autonomy and the idea of self-determination, but also dignity, right? That's why I aim to focus also on healthcare professionals, because I believe as medical doctors, as nurses, allied healthcare professionals, the practice of medicine itself is in defense and in protection of human rights. So if you go through your undergraduate training, postgraduate training, and you don't understand what the right to health means, you don't understand what dignity and privacy means for your patients, it means you are going to enable a lot of abuses, and in some instances be yourself as a clinician, in violation of people's rights. So it's very important to think about and understand the impact on women's health experiences and also choices, and that these are fundamentally human rights issues. And it goes all the way from when you're trying to plan and contraception, all the way to postpartum. All of those options are valid, but you have to be treated with dignity, with respect, and yeah, that's how I think I can best,
Thank you.
that one.
Thank you so much, Dr. T. Promise, if I may add, I thought the answer was fairly comprehensive, but what I thought you could perhaps try and respond to, and particularly since, if I may use the word, you had an intimate sort of engagement with the medical community, and of course it's been a relationship of power, inequity, really in these years or decade of advocacy. What have been some of the shifts you've seen in the medical community's sort of denialism? It is one of the questions from one of the participants, and I thought it could be an interesting question to reflect on. And then, of course, welcome other participants to jump in. Just indicate to me on chat if anyone else wants to also speak to that question. But to start off with, maybe Promise, you can start us off.
Thank you, Rupsa. Just on obstetrics violence, I support what Dr. T has said. And I'm speaking on this because, this issue has come here in South Africa where, certain quotas are wanting to call for sterilization, obstetrics violence, and, lump us with other struggles that are working on obstetrics violence. I just want to say that, international law defines forced sterilization as forced sterilizations. All UN agencies, that have to do with human rights just define forced sterilizations and forced sterilizations. And as you can hear, I'm becoming all emotional because if you look at the women or the population that are represented on this panel, it's women living with disabilities. It's indigenous women. We do not have women who are intersect, on this, but they've contributed to this process. You have Roma women, which are indigenous women who are also targeted for sterilization. And of course, HIV positive women. These are the women who sit on the margins of society. More often than not, these are the women, not even more often than not, who do not have movements. It's very hard, to get our issues out in the open, and it kind of feels like insensitive, and an act of silencing, to want to call sterilization something else, because all these women that are on the panel, and 72 women that are represented by Her Rights Initiative and HRI in this process, they all say they were forced into sterilization. They're not saying that they face obstetrics violence, and I think we also have to be, sensitive. We've said that our point of departure is intersectional and post-colonial, feminists. We respect other views, but I'm kind of feeling that, the liberal, views, have to, respect the spaces that we create for ourselves, and I'm feeling all emotional because, yeah, we've been working on this and living with this for 3 decades and working on it for at least, 15 years to get to where we are, and it kind of feels very personal for other people to want to put it in a particular box that looks cleaner and safer. Okay, yeah, and then in terms of the medical establishment, we had a meeting with a professor who is a gynecologist, an expert, one of the greatest experts, in South Africa. And then he reminded me after the call, that, actually this work is poor women living with HIV, targeting the medical establishment that has so much credence and credibility in the country. Medical establishment that is accepted in all ideologies of oppression, including racism, colonialism, eugenics, and all of that, and we're targeting them. And the conversation we're having, with him, is basically leading to us, through him, to having to, go to a medical school and ask the medical school to, investigate our bodies, so that it uses that evidence to call its peers into account, and he was saying this is the most difficult thing that he's ever done, but he is going to do it because, the doctors, the gynecologists, not just the doctors, should be standing, with us. And this is what this work, is doing and has done. And in terms of how they've responded, I mean, obviously they have justified their actions. I mean, some have denied, that this is happening, but most of them, have actually said, we didn't know what to do. This is what, was done, at the time. We're realizing now that it shouldn't have, it shouldn't have, been done, and others were saying, well, it's not us, it's the system. I never operate as a medical professional. It's the system that makes me to take particular decisions. And I have to say that when we launched, when the CGE, the Commission for Gender Equality, launched the report of the investigation that they'd been doing for 5 years, the chairperson of the South African Health Professionals Council stood up in that launch and said, I am ashamed of being a medical doctor in South Africa today. And that basically means that there are opportunities for solidarity with the medical fraternity. There are opportunities for consciousness building in the medical fraternity. And I would say this, not because we are here, Dr. Tlaleng, that we have the Dr. Tlalengs, we have, Professor, the professor that I was speaking to, because gender studies, feminisms, the understanding of women's bodies beyond the clinical was part of the curricula in your training. I know that you will mention people like Professor Barnes to say they are responsible for this, so that shows that it has worked, and there is hope, that the medical fraternity, gynecologists, if I can put it that way, can be, transformed so that they work with us as women who live in margins of society. Thank you.
Thanks, Promise. Yes, I think we can have a whole separate side event on medical denialism, but I will quickly turn to you, Alisa, and just want you to also maybe intervene on this question. And I can see we're at time, but maybe take a couple of minutes to also add your comments to this question.
Thank you. I just wanted to highlight that this is definitely an issue that is faced in Canada as well, and I think that it's something that permeates all realms and areas, including forced sterilization. We see this benevolent do-gooder kind of approach to things, this acquisition of control over the bodily autonomy and essentially destiny of other people, which is untenable in law. Absolutely. The justification game has already begun, and of course, and this was an open court. We heard health authorities say, well, sometimes there are medical reasons for sterilization, to which I responded, well, there are no medical reasons for sterilization without consent, are there, counsel? And then, that was the end of the story. So what we see is that push. And we see it very pervasively. There are reasons, there are reasons why this happened. Well, none of those reasons displace the obligation to obtain proper and informed consent. And that is something that the current situation struggles with very deeply. I kind of view it as a form of collective gaslighting, whereby the profession and those who fund the profession are essentially saying, no, it's not what you think. It's not what you feel. You're wrong. But in the words of Mumliak, who was the MP for the Nunavut territory here, who just recently said that she felt she didn't belong in the House of Commons as a representative, she said, listen to us, believe us, and then do something. And I think that is where we have to focus some of our efforts in understanding that our clients' voices and the voices of of Indigenous women and Black women who are experiencing these heinous human rights violations must be listened to and must be believed. And the profession must be held to strict account.
Thank you, Alisa. I know we are a little past time, so I think we've broadly managed to respond to most of the questions. So thank you so much for taking the time to respond to them. So I just want to close by saying it's been such a pleasure and such a privilege to be part of this discussion with all of you. I really want to thank all of you for your time, for your thoughtfulness, for your willingness to share not just about your work, but I think also about it's very personal, as you said, Promise, and therefore often sometimes the truth telling, when it's done by people for whom it's so personal, is not the easiest thing to do. But I thank you for doing so. I want to end by, of course, thanking all the people, all the organizations that co-sponsored this event. And in particular, want to acknowledge my colleagues at Sexual Rights Initiative. I do know that they're extremely committed and keen to continue to work on this issue in Geneva spaces. And I think we all acknowledge that there have, we, in that hour and a half, clearly we couldn't address every perspective that needed to be addressed. So therefore, there is certainly need for continuing discussions and conversations. And I think we have a lot of us who work in the Global South spaces have a important ally in Sexual Rights Initiative. And now we have Dr. T there. So we have some capture of the Geneva spaces. So hopefully we manage to represent ourselves, visibilize some of these issues. But thank you to everybody who attended this panel, for your questions, for staying the whole hour and a half. And it's goodbye from all of us. Thank you. Bye-bye.